the most physical activity I've done in a year. Hey everyone, I'm Claire Saffitz. I am here today for another episode of Try This at Home. Today I'm going to show you my recipe for an all-purpose enriched dough that takes the best of all worlds from Japanese milk bread and brioche. Very, very soft, super pillowy. It's only a little bit sweet and just gives you this incredibly light, almost like silky texture. The base recipe for this enriched dough is just to make it into 2 loaves, but I'm also gonna show you hamburger buns, and then I'm also gonna make sweet pistachio morning buns just to show off how versatile it is and how it can go sweet and savory. An enriched dough is a dough that has basically some form of fat added to it. So like a lean dough is a sourdough where all we're working with is flour and water and yeast and salt. An enriched dough has fat. Often that means eggs are added, so you have the yolks and it's adding richness in the dough that way. Or sometimes it can be butter, sometimes it can be oil. So today we're actually gonna do all of those. We're adding oil and eggs and butter. Even with all of those sort of heavier ingredients, because of the technique we're using, it still creates something so light and fluffy. And that's what's amazing about this recipe. This is sort of a pre-step that we're doing before we mix the dough. This is something called a tangzhong. This is a technique that's used in Japanese milk bread, but also in a lot of different kind of recipes to increase the overall ability of the dough to hold onto moisture and liquid. And that results in a very soft, pillowy dough, and it works really, really well in this style bread. A tangzhong is sort of like a roux. It is a mixture of flour and liquid that's cooked on the stove. So the heat is not on. I'm just gonna whisk these together. And now when it's all mixed together and smooth, I can turn on the heat. As this mixture cooks, the starches are gelatinizing and the whole mixture will thicken up quite a bit and it will totally transform. And then this is gonna get added to the dough. I sort of liken it to a smooth mashed potato. That is what you're going for. So now it's starting to thicken. It goes from liquid to this kind of thick paste really fast. And I've taken it off the heat now. Now I'm going to transfer this mixture and scrape it into the bowl of a stand mixer. Now, this next part is very important. This mixture is hot. I don't know if you can see, but there's steam coming off of it. I really want to let this cool completely. You will regret it if it's warm. The dough basically won't properly come together. If you want to make this straight through, you can rush the cooling process a little bit by throwing this in the fridge and stirring it every so often. So that's what I'm going to do. And now it's cooled. It has more or less the same texture, you can see. It's thickened a little bit. Now we're going to go ahead and mix everything right in the bowl on top of our tangzhong. The next thing I'm adding is a little bit of oil. You can use vegetable oil, olive oil, any kind of oil you have. The purpose of this is just to add some fat that is liquid at room temperature. This means that you can leave the dough, whether it's hamburger bun or just the loaf, on your counter for many, many days and it won't dry out. I mean, it's not a ton of sugar, but it also is balanced out by a healthy amount of salt. So it's sort of a flavor enhancer and a texture enhancer. So I'm using active dry yeast. In this recipe, I'm not gonna proof this yeast. I'm not gonna take it and dissolve it in a warm liquid. You know, in my entire baking career, I have very, very rarely encountered active dry yeast that wasn't alive. And then the remainder of the flour. Okay, so I have my dough hook on the mixer. So this is gonna help us develop lots of gluten, which is key here. I want to develop a very, very strong dough. The dough rises so tall in the oven. If it wasn't a strong dough, it couldn't support itself as it rises. Generally speaking, I like to make recipes by hand. So this is a recipe where you do want to use a stand mixer. If you have superhuman strength and patience, you can try it by hand. I do not recommend it. This is what happens when you're mixing bread dough. It almost always looks really dry in the beginning. It takes time for that flour to absorb all the liquid, and then you'll see there's a pretty radical transformation in texture. For anyone that has even a passing interest in making bread, I would say buy yourself one of these. I think they cost $1. This is called a bowl scraper. There's a lot of bowl scraping in this recipe because it is a very soft dough. And you can really see it in this glass bowl. So I'm just gonna scrape down the sides. Now that this dough has come together and I had it on low, I'm gonna put it back. And I'm gonna now let it go on medium low, so a little bit faster than we had it before. And go change your laundry, go do something, come back once or twice, scrape down the sides, but this is gonna go for like a good 12 to 15 minutes. By letting it go low and slow, there'll be a very dramatic transformation in the texture. It's looking good. So first of all, you can see that the dough has gathered around the hook, but it's not clearing the sides or the bottom. So you can see it's, it's sticking. That's normal, that's fine. It's mostly tacky and just a little bit sticky. I can kind of touch it and it won't stick to my finger, but if I were to really work with it, I would get some sticking lightly. The dough is looking good. We're gonna start to add the butter. As I said in the beginning, this dough incorporates techniques from a number of different styles of bread. We did the tangzhong from Japanese milk bread, and this is sort of more similar to the steps in a brioche recipe. And I'm gonna mix on low speed. Heat is kind of the enemy of this process. I want the butter to be cold. That's really important. We wanna have this just be mixed on low speed until we see the butter disappear, and then I'll add the other half. There's a lot of this in recipe developing. Just like sitting and watching it. Very Great British Baking show. I do the thing that they do also where I fan the thing and it comes out of the oven. I see that the butter has fully absorbed, and I'm gonna add the other half of the butter, but first give it a scrape. Okay. I'm not telling you to sit here for a half an hour and mix because it's funny or fun. It's important. You can see that the dough is now fully gathered around the hook. It's not sticking to the sides. I now want to increase the speed back to that medium low, and we are going to give it a final mix in the bowl. We are going for a super supple, beautiful, smooth dough. We made brioche in culinary school by hand, and you just have this super sticky mass that you're you're kind of smearing butter into it and just working and kind of folding onto itself. Eventually it comes together, but yeah. And I'm gonna show you a test for knowing if you've mixed it sufficiently or not enough. So I'm gonna pull off a golf ball size piece, right? This is called a Windowpane test. You might see this in bread books, especially in sourdough baking. And I'm going to work it outward. And the idea is that I have built enough gluten and the dough is extensible enough, meaning the ability to stretch, that I can get a very, very thin sheet of dough that will allow light to pass through and it won't break. I wanna see if I'm there yet. It actually looks, I think I'm there. I'm getting it pretty thin and it's not tearing. So I'm gonna take it out of the bowl. Now what we want to do is let this dough go through its first rise. Generally, recipes with active dry yeast go through 2 rises. So the first one is called bulk. So that's just the whole mass of dough all together. So I'm going to fold this dough in half a few times because I want to get sort of a smooth surface. And then form it into a nice tidy sort of package. You can see that the texture is, first of all, not sticky or not even really that tacky. The butter has kind of lubricated it, so it's got a slight sheen on it. If your dough is shiny and greasy looking, it's probably too warm. Just roll with it, it'll probably be fine, but just know that you don't want this dough to get very warm. This dough has a really wonderful texture. It's very tactile. It's really fun to play with. And I'm just gonna set this right back inside the bowl. I'm gonna let this hang out at room temperature for about half an hour, and that's because I want the yeast to begin to release those gases and metabolize some of those starches and sugars. And then I'm gonna transfer it to the fridge and let it continue and finish its rise very slowly in the refrigerator. And that's because this dough is so much easier to work with when it's cold. It's we get it going by 30 minutes at room temperature, and then it slowly finishes the rise as it cools down and firms up in the fridge. You could let this go overnight, and in fact, I set up some dough last night that is ready to go. But if you want to bake same day, just make sure you give it at least 4 hours in the fridge, and that's long enough for the dough to finish rising and also to get cold all the way to the center. 4 hours minimum, up to 24, into the fridge. I have 2 standard loaf pans here. I'm gonna line them with parchment paper. So here's a little bit of room temp butter. I'm gonna brush the bottoms and all the sides. One way to show off the really wonderful texture and browning properties of this dough is to bake them as straight loaves. And then you can choose to do anything you want with them. You can use it for sandwich bread. You can make Bostock, which is a style of a twice baked brioche, which is a delicious and very easy pastry. You can just have it for toast for breakfast, which I did a lot while I was testing. I like to line loaf pans with one piece of parchment that goes across the bottom and up the longer sides. The width of the parchment is the same as the width of the pan across the bottom. And then you just lay it inside. And now we've greased it, so the parchment has something to stick to. Smooth it out, make sure there's no air bubbles. And now you have not only a guarantee that nothing will stick to the bottom, but you have a means of lifting the dough out with these two little pieces that hang over. I'm also brushing the parchment with butter, not because it would stick, but because that butter across all the surfaces is going to contribute to browning. And I want it to be golden and like a little bit, even a tiny bit crispy. So my loaves are ready to go. I can set these aside. I'm gonna use this scale to portion out the dough into 16 even pieces, and basically I'm gonna get 8 little pieces that make up each loaf. So I'll show you how it works. First of all, look at how beautiful and domed it got. This basically doubled in size. I'm gonna turn it out of the bowl and onto the surface. I'm gonna pat the dough down and try to knock out some of the gases. This step basically will help to refeed the yeast. So all those yeasts, which are live organisms, when I do this step, it's basically gonna help them come into contact with new forms of food, new sugars and starches. So that's gonna be helpful in our second rise. I'm going to use this scale to measure out 16 equal portions. I'm gonna do 8 portions per pan. Now I have all my portions. So now I'm going to show you how to form each piece into a nice, taut, tall little ball. They are going to rise up and fuse together in the oven like cute, patterned little pull-apart loaf. If you were just to kind of create something that was more of like a loaf shape, it's less predictable in the way that it expands. Sometimes you get like a crack down the middle or it splits. This gives the loaf a natural seam where it can kind of start to pull apart in the oven. So I have a piece of dough here. This I could tell, this side is smoother. This I can tell is part of the dome that was exposed on the top. This side is smoother. This side's a little bit more mottled. So here's what I do. I sort of flatten it out and it's smooth side down. So now that I have this kind of irregular shape, they're kind of triangle or rectangular-ish. Now I'm gonna go around and I'm gonna tuck all of the irregular edges in toward the center. So just kind of go around and fold everything in. And now I want to gather all of those edges together and pinch. So you can see now I have this little ball shape and it almost looks like a garlic bulb or kind of a very fat teardrop. Now I'm going to put it on the surface, this time seam side down, just like that, taking one hand, and I'm cupping it around the dough. So my hand is sort of in the shape of a claw and it's resting lightly over the dough. And the motion here is little rapid circles. And as I'm moving the dough in a circle, I'm also dragging it across the surface. You'll feel the ball of dough start to tighten and become like taller. It'll sit up a little higher. There's like the seam side, there's the dome side, and then it just goes right into your pan. Okay, we have all the little dough balls in their formation and they're ready to go. So these have to proof. So there's quite a bit of expanding that happens during the proof. And then there's even more expansion that happens in the oven, and that's called oven spring. So it really does grow quite a bit in size. The proof time, it's been about an hour. These are looking about there, doubled in size. There's really no gaps left in between little balls of dough. There's something called the poke test, which is a means of determining if your dough has fully proofed. So I'm just poking on the top of the dome. Press your finger in. That looked pretty good. You can see there's my little fingerprint, but it mostly sprang back. The final step is to give them an egg wash. And then try to brush gently because you don't want to pop any air bubbles that are underneath the surface. Okay. And you'll see this wonderful, almost like cartoon bread loaf shape. They smell really, really good. There are myriad uses for this style of dough. It's so versatile. I don't know, it's like I'm not really liable to make hamburger buns, but it works so well. That's what we're doing today. I'm gonna make some hamburger buns. I have a dough that I set up actually last night. You can see that it got super puffy in the fridge and it's very firm because all that butter is cooled down. So you wanna work with this dough while it's cold because it's much firmer and it's just easier to handle. So when it comes to the forming stage, try to work with some amount of speed. I want to portion this into 10 pieces of dough, all equal size. So it makes 10 hamburger buns for like 4 to 6 ounce patty of any kind. So I have 2 baking sheets here, but I'm just using some neutral oil and brushing the baking sheets, okay? It's similar to that step I showed you earlier. I want to do the same thing because when you shape something properly, you get a beautiful even rise, and I want a round, beautifully domed hamburger bun, okay? And then just repeat that process with the remaining pieces of dough. Here are all 10 of our buns. These need to rise again. Now, this dough in particular likes to rise with a little bit of moisture. So I just have some like tap water here, and I'm just gonna basically like sprinkle on some water, just a little bit so that things don't dry out. These need to proof for like a nice long time, and I'll come back and show you what they look like when they're proofed. These are ready to go. I'm going to show you what they look like. Here's the test for whether or not these are proofed. There's a slight jiggle. So I know that these are sufficiently proofed. When I poke it, I can see the dough slowly spring back, and there's a slight indentation. So these are ready. Just makes me think of like McDonald's commercials, like with like the perfectly placed sesame seeds, you know? These are gonna go in the oven, 1 pan per rack, and then after 15 minutes, I'm gonna rotate, and they'll go about 20 to 25 total. It's easy to tell when they're done. We're just looking for an even dark golden brown color. They got so domed and so big, and very excited. Either eat them the day or the next day, and then freeze whatever you don't eat. They freeze so well. There's some power tools being used upstairs, but we're gonna roll with it. What are they sawing? Should I like get a broom and bang on the ceilings? I think a sweet bun, like a cinnamon roll or a sticky bun, is maybe one of the best applications of this recipe because it stays so soft. And what I don't like about a typical sticky bun or cinnamon roll is that they dry out and get really hard. And with this dough, they stay really soft and pillowy even after they've cooled. Oh, jeez. All right, I'm hurrying. This sort of reminds me of my first apartment in New York when my roommate and I like had this theory that our upstairs neighbors like had a bowling alley. It turns out I actually think he was like a bodybuilder and was dropping weights on the wood floor. I'm having flashbacks. So this gives you a nice generous layer of butter. So now I'm gonna put together the filling. I have here 1 cup of pistachios that I toasted. So you can finely chop these. I like how the pistachios in the filling give it like a little bit of a green kind of spiral in the final bun. A fine chop is what I like to go for. I'm gonna put together the rest of the filling. This is a pretty austere morning bun, and it just has a lot of toasted pistachios in it and some cardamom. Super delicious and has a ton of different textures in it. Now this recipe does not have icing, it doesn't have like a goo. The only topping is this sprinkle of this sugar mixture. So I'm setting aside 4 tablespoons or 1/4 cup of this mixture. And this I'll set aside, that'll go on top of the buns when they're baked. Now the remainder gets mixed with the pistachios, and then this is our filling. And now the last step is to create a little bit of honey butter. I love the addition of honey. I'm just using 2 tablespoons, but it does contribute a whole lot of flavor. So now I'm just melting the honey and the butter together. Most of that's gonna go on the surface of the dough, prior to sprinkling our pistachio mixture on top. I'm gonna reserve some of it for also brushing on top of the buns when they come out, and that is going to give this reserved sugar mixture something to stick to. My filling's ready to go. I'm gonna grab my dough and show you how to make the buns. So I'm gonna turn this out onto my lightly floured surface. I'm gonna roll it out into a fairly thin and wide slab. The important thing with rolling out is like you want something that's as close to a rectangle as possible, and that means that all of your buns are gonna be the same size. Then I just kind of lightly press it in, and I want even coverage across the entire surface. So now I'm ready to start rolling. I'm gonna start at the end closer to me. And I just kind of go like a little bit at a time from one end to the other and start to get the dough thinking about getting into a spiral. I squeeze the roll a little bit and I try to work from the center outward, and that just helps to like thin it out slightly and then make the entire thickness more regular and more even. I can like hear my mom being like, don't cut on the counter. My parents are freaked out about stuff like that. So you can see we have our really pretty little pistachio spirals. These are gonna go into the pan, cut side up. These have to rise again. I'm gonna cover them. They are going to get nice and puffy. This tray is ready to go. So I'm gonna show you what they look like. They have puffed up quite a bit. They are all touching. Wow. It looks very good. So this just gets brushed over. Between the Tower of Pistachio buns, the fast food commercial perfect hamburger buns, and our cartoon loaves of bread, it's a little overwhelming, but I think that this really shows off the versatility of a dough of this style. And the texture is just something that is like hard to beat. I'm just gonna pull off a little piece. Yeah. Here I have one of the pistachio buns, very lightly sweet. To me, this is the kind of thing you could eat in the morning and not feel like you needed a nap right after. Seriously, so good. Obviously, this is a very versatile recipe, but you're not limited to just hamburger buns or pistachio morning buns or a loaf. You could really use it in any number of applications, and that is what is great about Try This at Home. It's really about taking the learning from these recipes, experimenting, spreading your pastry and bread wings. So I hope you enjoyed. Hashtag New York Times Cooking. Is there a thing? Subscribe. Do or don't. It's up to you.